specifically as it relates to collective bargaining. There are three of us presenting today. First, we have Nancy Guyett, UniServ Director from South Central Indiana. We have Anita Vernon, a UniServ Director in Northeast Indiana, and then myself, Barb Deerdorf, a UniServ Director in Northwest Indiana. And we're starting with Nancy today.
Okay, folks, put on your seat belts because we're going to try to cover a couple hundred years of the development of labor unions in 15 minutes or so. So the first time we started to really see folks try to form unions with one another to advance their interests at work was when folks got a job. So in the early 1800s, people began moving to town instead of being sort of yeoman farmers and getting jobs, usually skilled craft kind of jobs. As they did this, they wound up meeting a boss, and bosses had all kinds of expectations that weren't natural. You know, getting to work while it was still dark out, working extremely hard for extremely little pay, often not enough to subsist on, etc. And so when they met a boss, they learned they needed a union, that they needed to join together to negotiate with their boss from a position of power. So that's when we first started to see unions. And as soon as we started to see unions, we started to see a legal backlash against unions. So as early as 1805, there was a group of skilled craftsmen. In this case, they were the makers of shoes in Philadelphia, and they joined together. They were facing employers who were bringing in more and more unskilled labor and trying to de-skill their labor and therefore decrease their wages. And they joined together to try to oppose that and get their wages raised. As a result of their action, where they went on strike to get some increased wages, they were prosecuted. They were prosecuted for engaging in an illegal conspiracy to raise the price of their labor. And it actually became a big battle between Federalist, Jeffersonian type folks and Hamiltonian type folks. But the Hamiltonian ones won. The judge instructed the jury that it was illegal to conspire to raise your wages under English common law, and so it was here as well. And a jury of their peers found the shoemakers guilty of illegal conspiracy, and they were ordered to pay fines. I have their peers in quotes because remember, their peers at that point, the people who voted in America and did things like serve on juries, were white men who had land as a possession, which wasn't really the peer of working folks. Despite this conspiracy ruling and the fact that the law was consistently adapted to fight workers' attempts to gain power, workers continued to form unions, and they continued to resist their bosses over issues like hours of work, working conditions, bosses' production expectations, the de-skilling of jobs, fair decisions about discipline, promotion, and termination, as well as wages. The fight has always been about more than just wages. Workers always found that the way to increase their power was through collective action, and they continued to form unions and assert collective power despite the law continuing to oppress them and think of new ways to suppress their voices. There was, for quite a while in the union movement, a healthy discussion that went on about where should unions focus all that collective energy? Should they focus them on trying to do political change as their primary effort? So efforts to promote things like the 8-hour workday or workplace compensation laws. And there were other unions who were out there saying, no, we should focus on very conservative gains in one workplace at a time and kind of let the politics fall where they may. And this was quite a tension for a while, and different unions tried different ways to solve these dilemmas. In the end, unions wound up kind of settling on both objectives, but that took decades and decades for that to kind of shake out. When public employee unions first started to form, the focus was primarily on lobbying. And at this time, I'm talking about like when the NEA formed in the 1850s, or the New York Letter Carriers, or the National Association of Letter Carriers. Their focus was primarily on lobbying rather than trying to achieve things through collective bargaining. They were trying to increase the amount of the pie available to the agencies that they worked for so that they could then get a higher share of that pie. That was pretty common of the dominant strain of unions at the time. Not too long after that, the American Federation of Labor began to get prominence, and they focused on that conservative, one workplace at a time kind of approach rather than the political approach. And these things existed side by side. Change continued to be hard fought. Here's where I'm going to speed through a few decades here. But you can see these are actual headlines about labor battles that were happening. Workers were constantly under attack, sometimes physically with guns and sometimes with Gatling guns. They had their wives and children set on fire in their sleep. They were subjected to criminal charges. They were even hung as a result of such criminal charges. There was a warlike atmosphere surrounding unions for a long time. Public unions started seeing advancements that were getting made at the collective bargaining table despite these obstacles. And they began to want to bargain as well as lobby. And specifically, I would refer to the post-World War I period, or the kind of the World War I period generally. International Association of Firefighters gets chartered by the American Federation of Labor, which is that more conservative workplace by workplace bargaining approach. The fraternal clubs begin seeking American Federation of Labor charters. This heats up in the post-World War I era, and the impetus for this, for many of these newfound goals of public unions, is these occupations begin to professionalize and they become careers that people stay in. They require training and sometimes certifications. And when that happens and people begin wanting to make careers out of these professions rather than just doing it for a little bit, that's when we really see the impetus to collective bargaining take off. So a lot of this comes to a head in a police strike that occurred in 1919. So there was a police fraternal club that had existed as a fraternal club for quite a while, but it sought and obtained American Federation of Labor charter. And once that happened, the police commissioner ordered the leaders of that group to renounce their membership in the American Federation of Labor. And when they said no, they were suspended from the force due to that refusal. The union promptly called a strike in the evening roll call. 2/3 of the workforce walked off the job. And within a couple of hours, looting had begun in the city. The looting was pretty bad. How bad is a matter of historical debate. Originally, the estimates were tremendous. The estimates that got printed in the local newspapers. But later there became a way to get reimbursed as a business if you were looted, if you could provide documentation of your loss. And the documented loss was only about 10% of what had originally been estimated losses. But anyway, there was violence and there was looting, and the state guard was sent. 7,000 infantrymen were sent to the city to try and quell the crime. Every member of the police force was fired for participating in the strike. At that time, and why I'm telling you all about this strike, is Calvin Coolidge was the governor of Massachusetts, and he wasn't really that beloved of a politician. He wasn't looked at as somebody with tremendously great prospects. But he became famous because he went out and said, look, there's no right to strike against public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time. And that carried the nation's newspapers, which were covering this salacious strike and surrounding issues with big headlines. And he wound up becoming famous. And then next thing you know, he's president. His maxim that there's no right to strike in the public employment got stretched to incredible limits, but that's sort of when that idea got cemented for public employees in many circles. Unions keep forming, private sector and public sector. In 1935, some unions got a legally protected right to bargain for the first time in our history. The act was called the Wagner Act, and it provided most private sector workers with that right to bargain. It did not protect domestic workers, agricultural workers, or public employees. And it takes a couple more decades, and private sector union strength really balloons after that, the passage of those legal protections and the legal obligation for employers to meet recognized unions at the table. But it's not until after those unions are strong and they begin supporting candidates for office who generally ascribe to union principles that public sector workers begin to see some benefit. In 1959, Wisconsin passes the first public sector bargaining law. In 1962, John Kennedy signs an executive order allowing his own employees in the federal government a process to gain union recognition and the right to collective bargaining. And after that, you begin to see a growth in public employee unions in the nation. In 1968, we finally have the Supreme Court of the United States recognize that you should not be able to just be fired for just joining a union, that ability to join a union is protected by the First Amendment. So that's good, but that doesn't yet give that union a right to collectively bargain. And when we really see movement begin there, all starts with a strike of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. These workers were universally Black men. They were in the Jim Crow South. They were treated extremely poorly. They had been complaining about the safety of certain trucks and they were ignored. They had a coworker be crushed to death by one of those trucks malfunctioning. There was no workers' comp for that person's family. There was poverty level wages, so it's not like there was anything for that family to rely upon. They didn't have any insurance, any kind of sick leave. It was a terrible job. So these workers went on strike, and they tried to get union recognition to bargain for them. And the mayor argued that it was illegal for these city employees as public employees to strike. And this became both a labor battle and a civil rights battle. It got national attention. You can see from the picture there, the National Guard was sent in. Dr. King traveled there twice and he was there in support of that strike when he was assassinated. After the assassination, some of the oomph got sucked out of the management, right? They were getting a lot of bad press at that point, and they eventually agreed to recognize the union and to negotiate a contract, and they did so. And that sort of saga playing out on national TV in front of people became an impetus for public employees all over the place, in various cities all across the nation, state by state, to begin to earn the right to bargain. Sometimes they won it by state statute, sometimes they won it from just their employer finally agreeing, like happened with the sanitation workers. But that's when we see public employee collective bargaining really begin to cascade and build in momentum.
So meanwhile, Indiana's General Assembly is refusing to increase expenditures for schools, and ISTA, who's considered to be one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in the state, is growing frustrated with the salaries of teachers, especially after legislators imposed a tax rate ceiling, putting schools in a financial bind. The ISTA president at the time had been quoted as saying, "Teachers are no longer willing to take crumbs from the community table." Seems like no matter how much things change, they stay the same, right? In 1968 alone, 8 teacher strikes had occurred across the state. Highland Classroom Teachers Association negotiated the state's first master contract addressing salary, benefits, and working conditions. 5 years later, only 18 master contracts had been negotiated, while 13 strikes had occurred. The 1970s is a decade of change. ISTA's new executive director sees teacher activism and unionism as top priorities for ISTA. He came from Michigan, where he had seen how Michigan had already won the right to collectively bargain, and he wanted to see that happen here in Indiana. At the same time, Indiana Attorney General Ted Sendak issued an opinion that not only did he believe that school districts and teachers did not have the right to collectively bargain, but that the current contracts did not have to be followed. So you can imagine across the state, school districts stopped honoring those provisions in those master contracts. ISTA leadership knew there were only 2 roads to resolve this: lengthy court battles or the passage of legislation giving teachers the right to bargain. Unlike today, gubernatorial candidates were chosen by each party's state convention instead of during the primary. In 1972, Elaine Gust, who was a member of Warren Township, organized 80 members to serve as delegates to the Republican State Convention. Of those 80, 40 survived the handpicked process by the Marion County Republican chair. The convention was a deadlock over which candidate to select to run for governor. Otis Bowen came and spoke to the 40 ISTA delegates and promised to support the passage of a collective bargaining law for teachers. And those 40 delegates broke ranks with the other big locals, those being Fort Wayne, Evansville, and Indianapolis, and threw their support behind Otis Bowen, who was ultimately elected governor in 1972. And true to his word, Governor Bowen put his staff lobbyists on the floor of each house to get enough Republican votes to enact a teacher bargaining bill in the very next legislative session. To this day, Indiana is the only state to ever pass a teacher collective bargaining law through a Republican House, Senate, and governor. And it was all because one teacher recruited enough people from a political party other than her own to run for state delegates. At the same time, 1973 sees the merger of Indiana Classroom Teachers Association and ISTA. There were actually 2 unions at that time. So ICTA had been the focus for professional issues, while ISTA focused on bargaining and advocacy of teachers' rights. And that merger brings 2 statewide organizations together and sets the stage for a big push to ensure teachers the right to bargain with the enactment of Public Law 217. PL 217 allowed narrow bargaining on salary-related issues like wages, fringe benefits, and hours. And that meant that female teachers no longer had to quit their job to start a family, and teachers can bargain sick banks and due process language. PL 217 also provided for mandatory discussion of other topics such as student discipline, curriculum development and revision, pupil to teacher ratio, etc. At the time, non-members were required to pay service fee to the bargaining agent known as fair share. And while PL 217 gave teachers the right to bargain, it did not protect them from retribution. In 1978, PL 110 was passed, giving teachers due process rights. Those rights were expanded in 1989 and again in 1991. Even though PL 217 did not protect teachers who went on strike, teachers continued to use strikes to win pay increases or to change working conditions in the 1970s. And after negotiating for 18 months with no agreement in sight, 388 of the 517 teachers at Marion walked out in August of 1978. And in that same month, 72% of the teachers in Richmond walked out after they refused to accept the school board's offer. The 1980s saw fewer and fewer strikes. Teachers were gaining more control in their workplace, and disputes were often resolved once teachers made it known that they were of their willingness to strike. Then we moved into the 1990s. Those would be trying years for ISTA, even though the Indianapolis Star still labeled us as a political behemoth, both feared and respected for its power and influence. In 1995, the state legislators passed legislation that prohibited us from bargaining that fair share provision into our contracts. The Republicans even overrode Governor Bay's veto, making it illegal for the association to collect fees from those non-members. Also in 1995, the state legislature singled out IEA by passing a law that severely limited their ability to negotiate with IPS. There was a judgment against IEA that allowed them to only negotiate salaries and money-related fringe benefits. It was one step forward and two steps back. It sounds familiar. At the same time, nearly 75% of Hoosier teachers said that they were inclined to vote for candidates endorsed by IPACE. The Indianapolis Star reported that the mere mention of Indiana State Teachers Association can do two things to a state legislator. It can prompt a surly scowl or elicit an enthusiastic endorsement. 2011 saw collective bargaining restricted to salary, wages, and wage-related benefits, and discussion was still mandatory, but working conditions were removed and evaluation hours and safety issues were added. Since 2011, we have seen legislators routinely and specifically prohibit things from being bargained, even though they were clearly pay-related, things like stipends. In 2023, just last year, Senator Rogers spearheaded the gutting of discussion. It became a may provision that might or might not include the exclusive rep. So in short, we need to gain back what we've lost. And there are legislators who want to take away what we have left. And it's up to us to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, to provide a little perspective, I'm putting a link in the chat for you to click on. This folder has a copy, or should have a copy, of every school district's contracts, last few contracts before 2011. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and click on that link. If that link says you need to request access, go ahead and put request access. But you're going to go ahead and click on that link to go to the folder of those last few contracts before 2011, and you're going to look for your school district's contracts. Of course, if we have any ESP and support staff with us who are in a school district that bargain, your contracts are still very robust compared to teachers' contracts. So go ahead and open that up. I'm going to give you another minute to get those files open and to look for your school districts. They should be in alphabetical order there. one thing that's, while you open those up, one thing that's really been in the news the last week or two is how under the so-called education reform initiatives, such as moving some of our collective bargaining rights from statute and some other reform initiatives pursued by Mitch Daniels, how educational attainment in the state of Indiana has decreased during that time. So I do feel like there's a bit of a turning of the tide or an examination of some of those policies and legislative initiatives. And I saw yesterday that Ball State professor Michael Hicks, professor of economics, who's always tweeting things, had come out against those reforms, or how those reforms had limited educational achievement. Of course, we all know that students' learning conditions and teachers' working conditions are not the same. So without us being able to negotiate for things like textbooks for students or curricular materials for students, student educational attainment has gone down. Okay, if you're having any troubles, put it in the chat and we'll get to you. But right now I'm going to put you into breakout rooms, and you're going to do a little scavenger hunt in your breakout room, and you're going to check your individual contracts for a few things, and I will also broadcast these things in the chat in case you forget them. But you're going to check those contracts for a couple things: prep time, evaluation, vacancies, like how do we fill vacancies, who gets involuntarily transferred, staff meetings, and anything else that surprises you as you scroll through. So prep time, evaluation, vacancies, staff meetings. So vacancies also includes transfer, and other surprising items. And I'm going to put those in the chat after I put you all into breakout rooms. So we're going to get the breakout rooms going. Give me just a second for that. And you can go ahead and start looking through your contracts to see if you can find those. Okay, you should be getting a notification that your breakout room is open. So you're going to go into your breakout room. You're each going to look for these things in your contract, and you're going to talk amongst yourselves about what you find. So you can go ahead and click to join your breakout. I'm going to have you put in the chat some of the things you found. So what surprised you about prep time that you found in those contracts? And what surprised you about vacancies? And what kind of things were you seeing about staff meetings? And what other things did you notice in those contracts? So go ahead and put those in the chat now. Okay, things were coming. Oh yeah, evaluations only every other year. I remember I got to the point where my evaluation was only every 5 years. Okay, thank you, Liz. Transfers were based on seniority. Yeah, we didn't have to worry about if we had upset the building principal and he was going to involuntarily transfer us to our least favorite grade or subject. All right, keep putting your answers in the chat of the things you noticed about the scavenger hunt items or other surprises you noticed. Test scores were not included in part of the evaluation. Absolutely. Prep time is way less now than it was back then. No problem, Sarah. Yeah, the ability to automatically have your own children in your school district without applying for a transfer. Limits on class size we found in some of our contracts. All right. What did you see about the staff meetings in there? Did anyone find anything about staff meetings? Okay. Committee to review class sizes, and the union was included in appointing and hiring aides. So you got to help choose your aides. All right, great responses so far. Okay, we had RIF language transfers, dismissal rights, due process, which days and hours you worked, family hardship leave, sabbatical, for teachers wanting to transfer, administration had to at least offer an interview. Yeah, we used to have lots of really great stuff that the Indiana General Assembly has been limiting since 2011. So what do we have to do now? A few things. One of the first things we have to do in the immediate next few months is to get Jennifer McCormick elected. So Jennifer McCormick is the candidate recommended by the Indiana Political Action Committee for Education, our political action committee here at ISTA. She and other candidates were interviewed by teachers and support staff, and she was chosen as the recommended candidate. As you know now, the governor has more power than the governor had even 10 years ago, because we no longer have an elected superintendent of public instruction. We now have an appointed secretary of education. And all of this nonsense about how the early literacy endorsement is being implemented is coming through the Department of Education, led by the appointed secretary. And the lessening of the diploma requirements is coming through the Secretary of Education. Additionally, of course, the governor has the ability to veto legislation. So our next immediate step is we all have to work to get Jennifer McCormick elected. Our secondary target after that is this legislative session. We have got to expand our bargaining rights. We need to be able to add some of these things back, like RIF language, like transfer language, like class size language, like prep time, the kind of stuff you guys found in your contracts today that you had the right to 15 years ago, that you don't have now. So let me put the PowerPoint back up for just a second. All right, so if you go to the website ipace-in.org, there's an opportunity for you to fill out how you are willing to help with the McCormick campaign. So please take a moment to do that. And then also, we have coming up 2 more sessions on power. So this session was about how we originally took power and then what our next step should be. And the next session is about using your power. And then the last session is, the last power hour is about building a movement. Okay, we're gonna open it up to questions now. And again, that website is ipace-in.org, where you can fill out a volunteer card if you're willing to do certain things to help get Dr. McCormick elected. So we will take questions now, both verbally or in the chat.
Hi, this is Beverly. I'm sorry, I'm driving and I'm just coming in town. What was that website again?
iPace, IPACE-IN.org.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? Yes, Dr. Terrence. we do need to target these school board positions, absolutely. And our local PACs, our local political action committees, will be happy to work on helping get candidates interviewed and making determinations about recommended candidates for school board positions. And then we also have funds available to help candidates who are recommended for school board positions. IPACE is considered nonpartisan. IPACE recommends both Democrat and Republican folks, and has done so since forever. What is the best way to message Dr. McCormick? I've attempted to contact her twice and haven't heard back. Anita and Nancy, would you say the best way would be through Rick Scalf, or what do you think is the best way?
I would say talk to your UD.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Is it for an event or a question, or like what's the?
Liz, could you put in the chat what you're hoping to speak to Dr. McCormick about? Policy questions. Oh.
So ISTA is going to obviously have a lot of policy information available, but I would still go first to the UD so they can be, if there are questions we don't have the information available for, they can be assembled, and we're not working too hard just trying to do that.
Yeah. Terrence, your person in charge of your campaign area just switched this week, so I'm gonna write sure that I let that person know that you volunteered on the website.
And they've just started kicking off with phone calls and stuff. So.
Okay, and then Archer, what's your question?
Hello. Apologies in advance if this is a little controversial.
Okay.
But I was just thinking about learning about the history of strikes and union organizing, and that the NEASO's strike recently at the National RA really throws up a lot of red flags. I didn't know if ISTA has been talking about that, if you're allowed to make a statement, if they're just kind of wondered if anything around that.
Yeah. Jennifer Smith Margraf is with us, and she is the vice president of ISTA. So Jennifer, would you care to comment on that?
Did I get unmuted okay, Barb?
Yes, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Okay, I'm driving, so apologies for answering this while I'm driving. So Archer, we don't negotiate directly with the NEASO staff. They're employed by NEA. And so our position on all of that is that NEA and NEASO really need to be working together at the bargaining table to resolve the issues that they have. And certainly the staff has the ability to do what they are doing and to participate in all the activities they're participating in. And we respect that, and we will not cross a picket line in any way, shape, or form, and we would not ask members to do so. If you've got additional questions, mainly because I'm driving and it's really hard to do this right now, if you wouldn't mind emailing Keith and I, we can touch base with you and give you a little bit more background.
So Jennifer, I think her question, if I'm reading in it, the question is, will ISTA go on strike if they hold this? Is that where you were getting at, Archer?
Well, I just didn't know, very recently,
Right.
I learned about the strike or whatever. But I didn't know if ISTA was planning on making a public statement.
About the NEASO strike, or about what we would do if someone came after us?
No, just about kind of like what you just said, like that.
So I believe, and I can't remember who all the email went to, but I believe that there was an email that came from Keith that I don't know if it went to every member, but it definitely went to local presidents and delegates to the representative assembly.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And great question, Archer. We, much like NEA has a staff union, we in Indiana also have a two staff unions. PSO, Professional Staff Organization, which Anita, Nancy, and I belong to, and ASO, the Associate Staff Organization. And we do not belong then to NEASO. We have our own local union and our own local contracts. Great question. Tammy.
Hi, also driving, so apologies for the background noise. I am with IPS, so Indianapolis, and part of the union, of course, but I grew up in an IBEW house, and my dad was constantly going to meetings. But at IPS, I have not heard of meetings. Like, I joined and I get emails, but are there actual meetings I should be attending? Or do we just not, is it just different than IBEW? I really didn't know what to expect. I'm kind of new.
So every local association is different, and I am going to send your information on to both the president and the UniServ director of IEA for them to respond, because I'm not
Okay.
familiar enough with how IEA operates to feel like I can respond with any degree of knowledge. But
Okay, well, great. Thank you. I'd like to be more involved if there's a way to be more involved, or maybe there's not. So, okay, thank you for that.
There's always ways to be more involved.
Yes,
Great.
always.
Hi, guys. This is Rosalind. I am the incoming first vice president of IEA. So what I can tell you is that there will be member meetings. We have meetings when it's the ARs and the executive board, but what's coming back online now is actual quarterly member meetings. So you will be getting upcoming information regarding that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Rosalind. All right, any other questions before we dismiss for today? We thank you so much for coming, and we hope you found this a useful investment of your time. Again, please do your best to help with the election of Dr. McCormick coming up in November, and then starting in January with the legislative session, we have got to work on pushing moderate Republican legislators to expand our collective bargaining rights. So thank you so much. Nancy and Anita, if you could stay on for a minute.